All right, let's get rolling here, and thanks everyone for carving out a little bit of your time. We know these last few weeks have been a little bit crazy, and so now we think it's actually kind of an interesting time to think about prioritizing your patient accounts, given that a lot of practices that we've been working with or speaking with have reduced patient inflow, reduced patient volume, so it gives them a chance to actually get caught up on a lot of these overdue patient accounts. And so hopefully some of the things that we review today will be relevant in helping you take this back to your team, your practice, and understand a little bit better ways that you can structure working your patient accounts and reducing those open AR bounces. So by way of introduction, just a quick intro, who I am. That is me and my picture there. My name is Andrew. I'm the Vice President of Customer Success here at Rivet Health. We do primarily a few different things, but primarily focus on contract management with the independent physician practice space, as well as kind of moving into the entire patient collections, from helping providers run eligibility transactions, create patient cost estimates, through collecting on those estimates and into patient collections as a whole. It's a little about what we do. My background is I come from healthcare. I'm not directly at a practice, but I spent about a decade in revenue cycle consulting, working directly with physician groups. So, seen and I've been exposed to a lot of different problems, opportunities, different types of projects, and one of the kind of CBO business office has been my focus for most of my career. So kind of love that stuff, and that's that's what gets me going every day. So quick agenda, talking through what we're going to talk about today. So 4 major topics that we're going to go through. And the first is, these are all kind of humorously named, but like, when did it really become so difficult to collect from patients? Then we'll move into some principles and some possible things to think about to grease the wheels of patient collections, make it a little more streamlined, a little easier. And then talk through strategies for prioritizing your patient accounts receivable. Or you'll hear me, if you haven't heard the term AR a lot, I refer to it as accounts receivable. But we'll go through some strategies for how you can better prioritize the massive volume of patient accounts. And then we'll have a quick little bit at the end for, I call them fire drills, but these little quick wins that you might be able to take back and clean up some of the overall hygiene of your patient accounts. So with that, we'll go ahead and dive in here. So when did it become so difficult? So taking us through the history lesson of honestly, in the last few years, patients have become one of your payers. The growth is primarily led from high deductible health plans, these HDHPs, which is, you kind of look at that graph on the right there. You look at in the last almost decade or so of high deductible growth, it's about doubled in the number of insured patients that are under 65 that have gone on to a high deductible health plan. And then you think about moving from, about a quarter of insured patients up to almost half of the insured population is now under an HDHP. You think, well, who can afford these high deductible plans? On a regular basis, we see plans that have $2,500, $3,000, $4,000, $5,000, upwards of $5,000 deductibles. And so when you look at that second bullet there, 2/3 of insured patients that are on an eligible HDHP would face financial hardship if they actually had to pay that deductible. And so regardless of if they have a strong HSA, if they don't have a health savings account or HSA, that's a lot of money to come out of the pocket. So we work with a lot of practices that do surgical services, and you're thinking some of these services can be $2,000, $3,000, $4,000 plus. That's a lot of money that might be shifted from the insurance responsibility onto the patient. With these super high deductible plans coming out, the bill is no longer an insurance claim anymore. With like, hey, there might be a $250 deductible remaining after. You're now getting, especially in the seasonality component of, early in the year with January, February, March, what we've seen these last few months working with practices is 30+% of the bill is coming from patient responsibility. And that's across the entire year. We've seen, even just looking at our customers who are running patient cost estimates and reconciling those to bills, we're seeing 40, 50, 60% of a bill coming from patient responsibility because of these high deductible plans. So you now have to cater to an entirely different payer than all of your other insurance companies. They have a pretty standard operating way of, if you get a denial, this is how you appeal. This is how claims are supposed to be submitted. This is our timely filing window. You don't have to cater to patients, which are highly undocumented, highly irregular, patient to patient, and it's a lot harder to scale up your your practices on how you can best collect from this vast array of different patients. And then on top of these higher balances, we're seeing is less and less procedures are covered by what we call copay only. That the entire thing is covered by a $25 or $40 or $50 copay, and instead it's going towards the deductible, towards the coinsurance and out-of-pocket maximum. So when you really think about the last few years, kind of looking over the last decade or so, your patients have become a payer, and you have to treat them very different than your insurance companies. So I'm just kind of looking into a little bit here, collecting from patients and why it's so hard. Kind of four major themes that I think through when we talk to a lot of our practices about collecting from patients and why it's difficult, what they could do better. And for starters, just clarity on things. So this first one here is there's a huge disconnect between what you working in a practice or a provider setting or a healthcare setting every day are familiar with from a industry jargon standpoint to what the patient actually understands. So 74% of patients are confused by their bill, which makes sense. There's a lot of technical things on a health insurance claim. You're looking at CPT codes, which most patients don't really know what a CPT code is, what a HCPCS code is. You're looking at in-network contractual adjustments. Again, these EOBs are not typically very easy to read or understand, and patients, a lot of times, this is the first few times that they've actually seen them. So from a clarity standpoint, there's definitely a disconnect between what you're familiar with seeing every day and what a patient sees when they get their statements. So there's a lot of confusion. This confusion leads to being really difficult and costly to collect from a patient. Now, if we think appealing denials to insurance companies are, high cost, a lot of time, it's actually 4x more costly to collect from patients than it is an insurance company or a payer. That's because it's highly irregular. There's not really a documented process on, oh, this is how you should appeal a patient not wanting to pay their bill on the first statement. So it's very costly to collect from patients. And because it's so costly and because there's a lot of complexity, we see a ton of patients going to collections or going to bad debt write-offs, whether it's you're taking it straight to hey, this isn't worth sending to a third-party collection agency, or you're actually sending that individual patient and their record out to a collection agency. 1 in 5 insured patients are sent, which is a lot, thinking that, hey, 20% of my patient population is going at some time going to go to a collection agency. And that might not necessarily be all ill-willed patients that don't want to pay their bills or can't pay their bills. We hear a lot of feedback that by the third statement, the patient still doesn't actually know that they have a balance. And it can be returned mail. It can be they don't even get the letter in the mail. And then they get this pre-collection notice, and it's saying, hey, you've got one final chance before you're being sent to a collection agency. And they're kind of, the patients are a little confused because they haven't even seen the statements leading up to that final collection letter. So a lot of effort goes into working patient accounts to see a lot of them go to collection agencies. And then thinking about the balances that get written off, right? We've now gone through, it's complex. Patients don't really typically understand what's going on with their bills. It's really expensive to collect from patients. A lot of them don't pay, and so you end up with a lot of write-offs. And so an average practice is writing off over 35% of their patient balances. And this definitely depends on the procedure mix that you're doing, the type of patients that you're servicing. This number can be higher or lower, but on average, we see about 35% of patient balances are just written off, which means zero cash value to a practice. So those are just a few themes we think from why collecting from a patient is actually so difficult. And then from looking at the processes internal to the practice, generally your systems are not optimized for patient collections. With the big push in EHRs the last decade or so, was really focused on clinical workflows and helping you get from visit to charge capture to coding, charge entry, and dropping a claim. They were not built with the patient in mind on how do I make a really efficient collections practice. And then you think outside of just what EHR, what practice management system we're using, what are the tools and tactics used to try and collect from patients? Well, the two primary ones on the left side there is you're mailing statements to patients. And on the right side is you're getting a lot of phone calls to your patients. An average practice is going to spend just about $2 to send a statement. And part of those are direct hard costs that if you're mailing a statement, there's no way to get around it, right? You're spending whatever the postage is that year or that date, you're spending that, and there's very little way to get around the cost of postage. But on top of that, if your reps, your team are sending these statements via mail, they've got to literally stuff an envelope, trifold it, put it in, try and hopefully you have some type of mail merge tactic in place to make addressing these envelopes really easy, or your statement is such that you fold it and put it in a windowed envelope, but that's still timed by your reps. Some practices we work with have an outsourced vendor where they actually kind of send them, hey, here's all the statements that need to go out, and the statement gets produced, but on top of the postage that is unavoidable, there's a premium for them no longer having to stuff an envelope. So there's a premium on top of that. And so you look at, hey, we're spending about $2 to send a statement out every month. How many statements are you sending? If you're a small to mid-sized practice, you could easily be sending 1,000 statements a month. That scales up pretty quickly as your physician count grows to the point that you might be sending 10, 15, 20,000 statements a month. And there's a huge direct cost tied to actually just mailing statements. And then looking at phone calls, it's most everyone has a cell phone handy and with them, but a lot of people are pretty bad about picking up unrecognized phone numbers. And so practices report calling patients 3+ times to collect on a balance. And so you think of the commitment that it comes up in your queue, you call the patient, even at best you leave a message that lasts 45, 60 seconds, and it goes in this queue of repeat cadence phone calls. So the number of calls that you're making it can be like a really big kind of consumer of your time. And then aggregate these two into like, hey, your processes probably aren't, or your systems probably aren't optimal for collecting on patients, but then add in the complexity of you have thousands of patient accounts that you're trying to work. Generally, a rep can't get through all of them every day, every week, every month. And so most of the practices are not effectively prioritizing which account should you work in which order. What is your highest either propensity to collect or highest risk on, so you can focus on the patient accounts that actually matter most. So kind of going through quick recap of like, when did it become so difficult? And it starts with the patient is now owing a lot more in the last few years than they ever have with these high deductible plans. Generally, it's really difficult to collect from a patient because it's really expensive. And then for the most part, your systems aren't built to be really efficient at patient collections. They're really focused on the clinical component with a little bit of trickle down into, I want to help you get a better insurance claim process by improving clean claim rate, reducing your initial denials. And not a lot of EHRs and practice management systems focus on how can I most efficiently collect from the patient. So with that said, we're going to open up real quick and go through our first polling question. So Lara, if you wouldn't mind reading off or I'll go ahead and take it actually. So out of curiosity, what % of your accounts receivable is patients or is patient related? And so we kind of bucket these and we're always curious. There are definitely some, if you look at the HFMA map keys or MGMA benchmarks, we've got option 1, kind of 0 to 20% of your AR is patient-facing, 21 to 40% of your AR is patient-facing, 41 to 60%. Your practice may be all cash, all cash pay or all patient pay, meaning that you only take elective or non-covered services, and then you honestly might not be sure. So we'll give people a few minutes here to get that voted, and then we'll go ahead and close it. Perfect. Well, thank you for voting. We will we'll go ahead and get that closed. So flipping gears towards, we know it's difficult. What can we do about it? So these next few slides will be just a few things to help kind of grease the wheels of patient collections. So starting here first, we are at Rivet, but also in the industry, financial transparency is becoming kind of a big deal. And about I think it was somewhere around a year ago, the White House came out with legislation that basically prompted hospital systems or healthcare systems to start publishing prices online. And then CMS adopted it. And then there's an anticipated go live of January 2021 of, hey, you need to post not only your charge prices, but your in-network allowables. And there's a lot of speculation around if that will pass and to what degree or what extent will we all of a sudden have to post our negotiated contractual allowables online. But all that's kind of in the framework of patients are becoming consumers, and they want to start understanding what their bill is going to be so they can make better plans around the expense component of it. And so this was a really interesting number when I was researching how many patients really want to know their balance. So 92% of these consumers, and again, notice that they use consumers instead of patients, because patients really are becoming healthcare consumers and shopping with that consumerism mindset. 92% of consumers want to know their payment responsibilities upfront. So thinking of if you have services, and again, it's very difficult across your entire spectrum of services to give an accurate estimate, right? Is it a level 3 E&M? Is it a level 4 E&M? But there are codes, scheduled surgical services, scheduled radiology services that fit into this patient cost estimate, this upfront estimate bucket really well, and to help the patient understand what is what is the financial component that's going to be coming out of your pocket for this visit. So step one of adding financial transparency is something that every practice should be doing, and it's financially clearing all of your patients. Now, there's about 5 steps here that I consider under financially clearing. There are a few additional things like making sure that you have authorizations and referrals on file, but these few are really focused on the literal financial component of clearing all of your patients. So first and foremost, make sure that you're running insurance verification on every patient every time. And we talked to a lot of practices like, oh, well, they were just here last month. I don't think I need to rerun their benefits. And you say, well, a lot changes in a month. Insurance could term at the end of the month. If you have 3-4 weeks between visits, it's very easy that a patient has gone to the ER and accumulated more of their deductible spent. And so, especially with this day and age of technology being so easy to run eligibility, is you should be doing it for every patient, every visit. It's just, a lot of systems can be run off of your schedule. They can be run with a click of a button. And so you can save a lot of time off of, instead of going to payer portals and phone calls, use your practice management system, use your eligibility vendor to make sure that you are confirming benefits, that they are both active and what their out-of-pocket liability total is for all these different types of services. If applicable, and if you can, take that eligibility response that's going to show, are they active? What are the relevant copays? What are their deductibles, coinsurance percentages, out-of-pocket maximums, and help them create a cost estimate. So pull in, what are they coming in for? A surgical service? Are they coming in for labs, radiology? Anything that you can do, actually use CPT codes and use your either contractual allowables from your contracts, or look at historical claims and say, what have I gotten paid in the past? I'll use that as a best guess for where I'll get paid, this next service. But pair those eligibility responses with your actual allowables and help the patient understand, this is what we think you're going to owe for this type of service based on your specific benefits. And then once you've run that cost estimate, communicating that to the patient, it's going to help them understand what, part of this 92% of the patients wanting to know up front is helping them understand what is their cost expectation. And then the benefit of that is you've now had that financial touch point instead of 2-3 months after the service following insurance adjudication. You've now moved that financial touch point right next to that service so that they compare, there's a clinical component and a financial component that I have to think about. And so you are going to basically accelerate their financial mentality several statement cycles further up in the revenue cycle. And then when you communicate those costs is a great time to have that financial planning conversation with your patients. So let's say they have $1,000 due for this date of service. How are they going to pay for that? What's your policy at the practice to pay for those? Do you require payment in full? Can you do a down payment of 50%? Do you have payment plan terms? Establishing that framework before the service is going to help the patient plan ahead for, well, how much money do I need to plan for this 2, 3, 6-month payment plan? Or do I have to put something down before this service? So making sure that you have an agreed financial terms before the service is going to reduce the effort that you have to collect from that patient. And last but not least, move towards upfront collections. You've been doing copays for years. Kind of move into, well, we've created a good faith estimate for deductible and coinsurance and out-of-pocket maximum. Here's what we require from a payment for this high dollar surgical service, and make sure that you have a policy in place around what do we collect for different types of services, and does that change if the patient has a history of bad debt, they have a low propensity to collect or pay on their bills. So making sure that you have a policy in place for collecting on those higher dollar balances up front is going to not only accelerate your cash timing, which I think most practices that we're talking with these last few weeks are like, hey, I would love to accelerate my cash because it's a tough world out there, but it's also going to reduce the cost to collect as well as the amount of write-offs and bad debt that you're sending. So that's all the components, again, very directly related to the financial component of financially clearing your patient. When you're talking a little broader space around transparency, helping patients understand multiple bills. So this is something that I hear from a lot of patients and a lot of family and friends is they're going into a surgery and they're expecting a bill, and then they get one from the surgeon or physician, they get a facility charge, they get an anesthesiology charge, and they're like, well, I thought I paid all these. And they don't know that each different component of their bill usually is billed by someone different. And now it's highly unrealistic to expect you to be able to quote other people's costs, but helping a patient understand the financial landscape that they will have multiple bills coming in is going to help them kind of understand, all right, this might be stressful. I might get 3, 4, 5 bills for the same service. Here's why it's happening. Here's what I need to do about it. And then because you're transparent, their overall satisfaction is going to be improved because they were made aware that they're going to likely be receiving several bills. Looking at historical balances, so that's one thing that I'm a big advocate for is notifying patients. If you get a repeat visit and they still have an outstanding bill from a service 4, 5, 6 months ago, making that patient aware that they have an outstanding balance when they check in for the next visit. They might not even know. Again, going back to patients are really bad at picking up the phone a lot of times, and we get a lot of return mail and a lot of bills just kind of get dumped in the trash. So they might not even know what their out-of-pocket or residual balance from a previous visit is. So helping them understand that they do have a previous balance and they can pay for that today, they can pay for it in the, set up a payment plan, whatever it needs to be. For some of the practices that we work with, I think dermatology comes up a lot, cosmetics come up a lot. If there's ever a non-covered or elective procedure, oftentimes that can be confusing to patients that they're like, well, I have insurance. You're like, well, yes, but this doesn't cover the, this is not medically necessary, or this is a non-covered elective procedure. So helping them understand those costs are going to be helpful, because a lot of times we hear patients just give us feedback that, oh, I have insurance. Doesn't that pick it up? And say, well, no, these are the reasons that it's not covered by an insurance company. So thinking about helping your patients find alternative funding. So I see this a lot in like cancer and oncology, HIV/AIDS clinics. A lot of times there are things like foundations, or there are group insurances that can be applied to a visit to help offset some of those patient costs. So I think of oncology specifically, there's oftentimes a lot of these foundations that will pick up these really high cost drug codes. And so, if you're a practice and you're not aware of what different funding options are, then there's a chance like the patient's not going to be able to pay for that. Even if they have insurance, they're not going to be able to pay for that visit. So be aware of what funding options are out there in the market. And then last but not least, this is something that always astounds me, is the lag between date of service and initial bill. Now we know there's things that you can't do anything about, and that's the insurance adjudication window. Hopefully you have very clean claims and your denial rate is very low, but even so, you're looking at best 3-4 weeks for insurance adjudication. But what astounds me is when there's a lag after insurance adjudication to first statement. And so I'd mentioned this before, but the tighter you can get that window, from the services rendered to statement dropped or bill dropped, then the more correlated the patient's mind is going to be by like, oh yes, there's a clinical component and there's a financial component. And so, don't leave balances unbilled for 30, 60, 90 plus days. Make sure that you have and most EHRs and practice management systems have the functionality to, when that primary insurance adjudication comes back, if it's a clean payment with no denials, move the balance to the patient bucket, automatically drop a statement 1 or 2 days thereafter. So kind of thinking through those things and how you can best add all the transparent components onto helping a patient understand, well, what are they responsible for? When does it have to get paid? How much do they have to pay? What are my other options out there is going to be really helpful. So looking at actually facilitating payments. So this is something that I get asked a lot, is to well, what else should I be doing to take payments? And one thing that we see is a lot of practices have been pushing patients onto patient portals. And patient portals are great for so many reasons. They usually have a clinical component, like you can access, my chart or your medical records or drug history or lab records. And so you can access all your clinical components on that patient portal. You can also look at outstanding balances. But one thing, and I will personally attest to this, is they're not always super accessible. So if one of your goals is to drive more patients to using an online patient portal, there's kind of 3 things to think about to facilitate adoption of a patient portal. The first one is you need to make sure that your patients can register and access that portal very easily. And this is, I had just moved, this was a few years ago, and I had just moved to a new state, a new city, new doctor, and it was a new EHR, and they had sent me home with just like a visit summary, and I had checked that, not thinking that I needed anything. It was just a visit summary on what was done, but there was a registration code for a portal. And so they basically dropped a statement and said, your bill is online in a patient portal. You can pay it online. I tried to access it. I didn't have my registration code. They apparently couldn't reproduce a registration code. So it was very difficult to get in and pay, and they were pushing all of the payments to come through that registration or that online patient portal. So if you're going to be using portals, make sure your patients know how to get to it and that you have an easy way to refer them back to, oh, here's how you can access your portal. And the third one there is looking at consistency. So we see a lot of times, you're going to push by default, your kind of fallback is, yep, we're pushing you to the online patient portal. Everything goes there. We've invested a lot of money in the actually setting it up, connecting it to our EHR. And then it's not always consistent in how balances are pushed there, on how communication is transferred to the patient as, hey, this is where you should go to pay your balances. So make sure that you're consistent across the entire organization on when and how best to use the patient portal. Looking at physical transactions, so credit cards. If your practice is not set up to take credit cards in a few different ways, then you're probably making a little bit of friction on the patient financial transaction. So if they can't pay at the point of service, you may have kiosks set up. If they require, hey, you have to call in with a credit card, you can't pay at registration or at check-in, then again, you're making it a little more difficult for that patient. Credit cards are very easy for patients to pay. Down at the bottom there, we have 40% of patients state that a credit card is their #1 preferred payment over, again, cash, check, ACH, like kind of deposit style transactions. And so the swipe of a card is easy, and you should be able to facilitate that right there at registration. Over the phone, if they call in, they get a statement and say, hey, can I just pay my bill right now? If there's an easy way to go through the portal and make sure that that's set up to collect from credit cards, that is one of the easiest transaction ways that you can make. Cash is another thing that's somewhat popular among a fair amount of patients. Is the old saying, cash is king. It's easy to collect, and people oftentimes we see a $25 copay, and it works out that it's really easy. People have $25 in their wallet, and from literally their bill configuration, it makes it easy to pay. So making sure that you have a process in place to collect the cash. Usually that's done at registration, or they have mail-in payments, but make sure you have the proper cash collection practice. Goes to a lockbox usually, cash gets posted that same day, next day type of thing, but making sure you can adequately accept cash. And then that last bullet there, it's actually for whatever reason, healthcare is usually very slow to adopt new technology. But patients as consumers, especially younger generations of healthcare consumers that are, in their 20s, 30s, that have been using smartphones for the last decade plus, are pretty familiar with flexible payment options. And that includes things like Apple Pay, text to pay, Samsung Pay, Google Pay, that you get a statement right on your phone, you get a link with your bill, you can quickly pay it. And I'm a sucker for that. I shop on Wayfair, and they make it so easy to pay via Apple Pay. I probably buy a lot of things that I don't need, but it is such an easy transaction that it's a joy and it's a pleasure. So believe it or not, these modern payment platforms actually work, and they increase generally the checkout speed. So in the literally consumer world, they, by kind of greasing the transactional wheels, it decreases the amount of time that the patient is spent thinking about the transaction, and it accelerates how easy it is and how effortless it is for your patients to pay their balances. So, and then last but not least, into kind of this section of greasing the wheels, is financial touch points. And the first thing that I tell a lot of practices, just because you have more financial touch points with your patient does not mean that you're in a better position or better situated to collect more. And so that first one, more does not equal better, is definitely true, because you can have some very, I don't know, sounds bad, but very meaningless financial touch points with a patient who just generally does not feel like they're a valued patient. So make sure that if you're going to increase the frequency or cadence of your financial touch points, that you do it with a goal to help patients understand their liability and incentivize the payment. So that can be done a number of ways, but if you just bombard patients with calls, emails, phone, or statements, letters, then you risk the patient turning apathetic to balances. And that means like, yep, this is my fourth statement. I can't pay it right now anyways, like sending me to collections. And so you risk that apathetic response from patients, whereas you want to actually be an advocate for the patients and incentivize them, like, hey, you had a great experience with our practice. We need to take care of the financial component. And that's their incentive to actually pay their balance, is like, oh yeah, I did have a really good experience with that practice. I want to turn that in so I can, the next time I have something come up, or I have a chronic condition or recurring visits, I want to maintain a positive rapport with this physician practice. So that in mind, when you're looking at developing a formal cadence for your statements and calls, letters, pre-collect letters, whatever it may be, is be very thoughtful about what's going into each statement. And as right, a lot of times it's like send 3 statements, final collection letter, they're going to collection agency. That can be brutal. And so the tone of statements can definitely change, whether it's the first statement, second statement, third statement. If it's the final collection letter, you can definitely develop a better process and a better cadence to, well, instead of statement, phone call, it's, hey, statement, we send a phone call, or we make a phone call, or we send a text with a reminder to their balance. So there's a lot of different modern communication platforms that you can utilize in being really creative to try and connect with your patient in a few different ways. So that last bullet there is about the modern platforms that I was just mentioning. It's like, for example, you have text message, you have email. Now you have to be pretty careful with how you use those, and when you send things and what type of content you deliver in those messages, in those text messages. But again, a lot of people have their phones with them pretty much every single day. And if you're able to text patients, says, hey, you have an outstanding balance, or just you have an open question at this physician practice name, it makes it so easy for them. You include a little phone number in the text. I'm sure you've all seen that, most smartphones, you just click on the phone number in the text and it starts dialing, and it's going right to your billing office, right to your accounts receivable office, whatever department, customer service, whatever it is. You can connect patients very easily. And by using those modern platforms, looking at the overall cost of things, now go back a few slides to that. It costs about $2 to send a statement. It costs a fraction of a penny to send a text message. And a lot of times it's going to be preferred and provide a better patient experience, which is going to drive your improved collection rates. So adopting those modern communication platforms is going to be really beneficial for the practice overall. So that moves us into polling, polling question number 2. So I'll read this one out. and it's how do you currently prioritize working your patient accounts? So something we kind of get a feel for how this functions, but there's a few different options here. So, and I'll kind of slide this one over here so you can all see, but you can work your patient accounts just purely highest dollar. You can work oldest accounts. You can do structured shared risk levels that you're looking at, well, what is the risk? What is the balance? What is the propensity to collect? Honestly, kind of all over the place. It's a grab bag of patient accounts that they can work. And then like, whoa, people actually prioritize working accounts. And then last, there's that fully outsourced and other not sure. So we'll go ahead and close that then, and we'll move on to actually strategies for prioritizing your patient accounts receivable. So cool. All right. So looking at probably some of the most relevant information is everyone has open patient balances, usually a lot of them. Usually it's now creeping up on it. What used to be 15% of your open AR has now gone to 20, 25, 30+% of your open AR. And so you're working through how best can I prioritize working these patient accounts? And you've probably done a great job starting to work on your insurance components of your open accounts receivable by looking at what type of denial is it, what is our timely filing, our appeal window. And the same logic needs to be factored in when you're thinking about strategies for prioritizing your patient accounts receivable. So I kind of hopping in here. What you work matters. And what I mean by that is you can't just take, let's say you have 10,000 open patient balances. You can't just take a random handful and expect to be really efficient in collecting if you don't have a prioritization method in place. And so what you work matters, and by not prioritizing your workflow, you're most likely impacting productivity. You're definitely crushing efficiency because you're kind of all over the place with what you're working, and you're not going to be very great when it comes to what are you collecting on open balances. In an ideal case, I think that this is the pie in the sky dream world is your team or your team of reps, maybe it's yourself, you sit down and you know exactly what accounts to work in which order because they have a defined risk level. They have defined, hey, this is the order at which these accounts should be worked. So you're always working the most, again, depending on how you prioritize accounts, you're working the most relevant ones first. The typical reality is reps sit down and they have, well, I've got 2,500 accounts assigned to me, 3,000 accounts, 4,000 accounts. I guess I'll just start and we'll see what kind of pops up in my workflow. And so the overall impact of that is you're generally seeing definitely suboptimal collection rates. And so what I mean by actually collection rates is you have open balances, how much are you collecting, and then what is the delay or the time it takes to collect those, and how much effort is exerted, how many phone calls, how many statements. So those, looking at some of those suboptimal collection rates. So what are some options? Kind of big disclaimer here is you may choose, depending on your different practice type, you may find that different options work better for different practices. So I've tried to just put out there a few different things that I've seen or that we've helped build from how should I be working things? So one of the most common ones is looking at yield opportunity. It's more commonly referred to as working high dollar down. Now there's definitely some pros. You are working some of the highest dollar accounts, so you would think that your bang for your buck is really, really high for that. Hey, instead of working a $50 balance, I'm working a $2,000 balance. The con to that is oftentimes these high dollar balances remain unpaid for a reason. They're too high for a patient to pay. They're well into their out-of-pocket. They've cleared the deductible and into their out-of-pocket. So the highest dollar balances are usually some of the hardest to collect. Patients are ill-equipped. Going back to that first slide we looked at is a lot of patients would face financial hardship if they actually had to pay their entire deductible. So the downside of working purely high dollar down is you may think that you're getting the most bang for your buck, but the amount of touch points, the amount of statements, the amount of phone calls, and eventually the amount of, hey, if you can just settle this balance today, we'll give you 20, 30% off. All of a sudden, those high dollar balances don't become that efficient to collect on. But again, keep in mind, you're always working some of the highest dollar. Looking at age of account / risk level. So these are usually helpful when you're trying to do an AR cleanup. where you're like, hey, I've got this long right tail of how old these patient accounts are. So by chopping off that right tail and working those older accounts, you can accelerate the overall age of your open AR by trimming down that tail. And if you look at the distribution of open accounts receivable, you kind of look at these buckets of, well, how my patient AR is how much falls into 0 to 90 days, 90 to 180, 180 to 365. At what point do I write the balance off entirely? There are percentage targets that you want to hit of your patient AR greater than certain days. And so if you can trim down that tail, then you're going to basically cut down on the overall average age of your patient accounts. So over time, you're going to get closer and closer and closer to the date of service, which again, we've mentioned several times, is really helpful in connecting the patient from a mindset of clinical and financial. The con of that is you're still probably not addressing the most bang for your buck. These old accounts, that could be really old things that have been on payment plans for 2.5 years. They could be things that have sat out and you've gotten statement, and nothing, and you just haven't sent it to bad debt yet. So you might have really low collection rates. The third option, looking at propensity to pay. Now this is really interesting to look at because it generally yields some of the highest collection rates, is if you're working the highest propensity to pay accounts, you're going to get the ones, well, the ones based on a few different soft factors, such as what is their credit score, their payment history, their geographic location, what is their balance. Looking at a combination of propensity to pay, it's like, well, these are the accounts that our system has defined is the most likely to collect on. So you're going to have really high rates. The downside of that is it's also one of the hardest to develop. So you have to figure out exactly what balance thresholds you want to use. What are you going to hit a soft credit check on patients? Again, that's becoming more and more of a thing, is being able to check, like, well, do they have a history of bad debt other places, or collections activity other places? So while it is really effective in improving your collection rates, the downside, it does take a lot of upfront investment to be able to set up that propensity to pay calculation. And then last, the hybrid yield / risk. So this is kind of looking at both a hybrid of high dollar and how old the account is, and developing risk levels. So it does assign a risk score. So you can stratify these into 4, 5, 6 different risk levels. And then your team is always working these risk level ones. And it's based on a combination of how old the account is and how high the balance is. The downside, generally it's going to have a lot of internal discussion on, well, what do you want to optimize for? Are you optimizing for purely dollar? Are you optimizing more on age? And how do you find that balance? And then again, you might have some accounts that, because they never come up into a risk level, that it's like, just honestly doesn't hit the workflow frequently enough, you could get some older accounts. So those are hopefully helpful in helping you think about, well, what could I be? How could we be prioritizing our patient AR? Should we be doing something different? What do we do right now? What I can say is a lot of practices probably think that they're fit into one of these 4 categories, and it's, if you like the way that's done, what improvements can you do? What more structure, policies and procedures, or standard operating procedures can you implement to make sure that everyone in your AR team is on the same page with how accounts should be working? And I think overall, that's one of the biggest themes here, is making sure that your team is on the same page and working things in the exact same way. So moving on here, we've got, we've got our third and final polling question. And these are really interesting because I'm just always kind of curious. So let me go ahead and get that. And you guys, let me know if you're having issues seeing that polling question, because I'm not seeing it pop up on my end. So we'll just kind of move through this one and hop straight into making a transition from either what you're working on today to, if you liked one of these models, if you've always had a plan in your mind of how can I create this really efficient patient collections process, there's some things that you got to keep in mind when you're making a transition. These are usually not like overnight decisions. It's like, yep, we're moving to a risk level or a hybrid model. Generally, it's going to be a little bit of a painful switch. And so definitely start with aligning that what you're doing from a current collections rate is not excellent. You can always be better at just about any any component of the revenue cycle, but aligning that we want to get better at patient collections, we want to cut down on our open patient AR is going to be kind of phase one on project management 101. Like, make sure all the stakeholders are in agreement that it is in fact a problem. And then set kind of a measurement target. So where do you want to get to? And it might be purely, we want to improve our collection rate from this percentage to this percentage, or we want to reduce our cost to collect from this many dollars per dollar collected to this. So set a goal and then communicate that goal and that problem across your teams. So that's going to start with your executive or your leadership team, and it's going to trickle down to make sure your team is on board with, hey, we want to find a better way to work our patient accounts. And then from there, start small. It will be very painful if you do a broad sweeping change kind of overnight, over a weekend, and say, all of a sudden, this is your new workflow. There's going to be some accounts that will probably get lost that haven't been configured properly. So start small and lay this foundation kind of brick by brick into, well, what do I want it to look like eventually, and what are the steps I can take to get there? And so some things that you might possibly be able to try is like starting with an individual rep and saying, well, if you were to change your workflow, how does that look like kind of on a pseudo pilot? You could play around with different balance thresholds or aging thresholds until you get to yep, this is what we've decided on as an organization, let's scale it up. And then once you've kind of agreed on, hey, we've built this little pilot, we think this is the most efficient way to do it, standardize the process across the entire team. And that needs to be ironclad documentation. If you have systems that you're leveraging, make sure that you are putting those systems in place with the standard operating policy, and then be consistent with everything that you do. Make sure that if you're doing account reviews, if you're doing weekly reviews with your team, productivity, dashboards, make sure that you're tracking the right type of metrics and being consistent. So moving on, kind of wrapping up here, quick wins for AR hygiene, and then we'll leave a few minutes just in case there are any questions. So I like to call these things fire drills, and as a consultant, they were often helpful things to think about when you're prepping to make a transition into a new staffing model, into a new workflow model. And it's, what are some things that we can do to quickly clean up some AR components? So one of the things is running what we call a credit applied to a debit, which is, if you've never seen multiple patient accounts with different balances, you can have a $50 credit on one account and a $50 debit on the other account. And it was a payment that came in and they paid via credit card and it got posted to the wrong account, or a handful of reasons that it could be balance offsets. So you can move that money and reallocate it so that you actually have a net zero balance. So there are a couple restrictions around this, and you can't just kind of take money from one and put it to the other. But if it's the same guarantor, same patient account, usually you can pretty seamlessly just move that money and zero the balance out. You obviously review, it's like, should there be a $50 credit? Like, was there an insurance overpayment or something, or do we collect something incorrectly? It does require a little bit of review, but those are pretty low-hanging fruit when you just want to clean up both debit and credit balances in the patient space, is moving the balances to cover each other. Looking at, low dollar write-offs are always something it's a hot topic. Like, well, what is too low for us? Do we want to collect on a $7 balance, a $4 balance, a $16 balance? Most practices and systems have a defined low balance threshold where it literally does not make sense for you to invest the time from a rep to collect that balance. So if you have accounts sitting out there that have met their, generally we'd say, don't just write it off because it's a low dollar. Look at, like, has it been unsuccessful in collections up to this point? And if it's old enough, sure, take the hit. It's gonna, again, communicate these things with your finance team, with your accounting team, that we need to clean up AR because our team is now working $7 balances, and it's not necessarily a super helpful use of time. So looking at anything that's below low dollar balance thresholds. Looking at guarantor payment on dependent accounts. So we see this a lot in like family medicine or pediatrics, where there's a guarantor account and there's also an actual patient account that has the clinical components of it. And sometimes the payments get misapplied, and so you have kind of this guarantor payment comes in, but it's not applied to the specific patient encounter. So looking at those to make sure that the balances are cleared up and reconciled. Grouped balance settlements. These are always really interesting because you can oftentimes cluster several balances together. And let's say you take 4 or 5 different visits together and the total balance is $500. Come to the patient and say, hey, if you can cover all 5 of these balances, we'll give you a defined adjustment percentage, whether it's 10%, 20%, or whatever it may be for the practice. Helping them settle all of those balances at once it's actually gonna increase their propensity to pay, because, all right, you're gonna stop sending me 5 statements every month. Great, I'll just take care of all these, and because I took care of all of them at one time, usually there's some type of discount. And then the last one, it's kind of going back to the risk levels a little bit, but have a high priority work list. And that can be, it can be a data query that's created, it can be an Excel sheet, it can be anything that shows, hey, these are our top accounts, and we want every rep to hit 10 of these accounts every day, type of thing. Whatever that, again, that focus is like, define what you want to be your highest level priority of accounts, and make sure that your reps know that those are the ones that you want them to be working. So those are just kind of 5 helpful things when I talk to a lot of practices before we go into total workflow, like workflow switch. It's like, well, make sure you're coming in with as clean a patient AR as possible. Otherwise, you're going to push a lot of these accounts into this new workflow paradigm, and it's going to be pretty painful because you have a lot of volume that's dormant, is stale, it's not collectible, or it's not even a valid balance because it can be adjusted off with a different credit balance. So there's just a few tips that we found to be helpful. So with that, we will open up just a few minutes if there are any questions. Feel free to type them in. There is a Q&A, and we'll try and address these. So we'll kind of open Q&A up via the chat window here, and stick around for the next minute or two. Perfect. Well, I'd encourage, if any of you have any additional questions, you can reach out to us. If you want to reach me directly, you can chat in. Our website is rivethealth.com, or feel free to email me directly. My email is andrew@rivethealth.com. Feel free to email, respond back, whatever it is. We'd love to chat through and answer any questions you may have. So with that, we'll thank everyone for joining, and stay safe, stay healthy, and we'll hope to talk to you soon. Thanks.